The battle for a higher minimum wage in Michigan and across the country, plus the DIA pledges to raise millions in a deal for pensions and art, and a new partnership to go beyond the headlines of Detroit's bankruptcy. It's analysis of stories making news across the state. MiWeek starts right now.
Michigan's turnaround is being powered by things we do better than anywhere else in the world. Today's global leaders routinely turn to Michigan to work on their most difficult problems. That's because the engineering talent in this part of the world is simply the best. So many possibilities lie ahead for Michigan's future. These opportunities are here and starting to happen. The vision for the new Michigan. Share it, talk it up, drive it home. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Good evening to you, and thanks so much for joining us for MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. Busy week here in Michigan. Now that we've all stopped complaining about the cold, let's take a look at what's ahead coming up tonight. The push to raise the minimum wage is on here in Michigan, as well as across the country, as you heard in the President's State of the Union address this week, why this could be a big issue this election coming up. Plus, developments in Detroit's bankruptcy. The DIA pledges to raise $100 million in an effort to protect art and pensions, and the city's plan of adjustment, what it all means for Detroit's path out of bankruptcy just ahead. And a new media partnership that we are proud to be a part of that will be going beyond the headlines. We'll explain that for you. But we start tonight with the contentious argument over raising the minimum wage. There's an effort to put this question on the state ballot in November, but the governor says it's not a significant issue for his administration. Joining me now, our MiWeek contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. Gentlemen, how are you this week?
Well, for the record, I have not stopped complaining about the cold.
Oh my gosh, I don't think you're going to stop complaining until it's like April or May.
You can't complain about the cold. It's Michigan.
No,
you're not allowed.
But this is extreme
doesn't
cold.
matter.
This is ridiculous cold. And
Move to Florida.
we should also note that we are also the warm-up for Big Buck Night tonight.
That's right. It's
coming
a very
up
big night
on
here
PBS.
at Detroit
Favorite
Public
PBS
Television.
night.
That's right.
All right, well, let's get started with the debate over minimum wage that everyone is talking about. Here in Michigan, we are $7.40 an hour, which is already above the federal level of $7.15 an hour. Do you think that this issue is going to get much traction in Michigan? No.
Yeah, of course, because it's an election year, and Democrats are looking for any issue they can talk about other than the economy and the poor job creation record of the administration. And Obamacare, and that's what this is all about, to distract from the real issue. So yeah, you're going to hear a lot about the minimum wage. There will be an effort to put it on the ballot, and if it follows past form, the legislature will end up doing some sort of minimum wage hike to keep that thing off the ballot and keep it from impacting voter turnout.
Well, let me ask you this. Why isn't this a real issue when you have many people who need to have perhaps a higher wage to be able to invest back in the economy when they're working jobs like this?
The real issue is that we haven't created enough demand for workers and jobs in this economy. Back in the 90s, when we had pretty close to full employment, nobody was making the minimum wage because the demand for workers pushed wages up. You can't artificially set the minimum wage and tell an employer, well, here's what you got to pay, whether you can afford it or not, whether your workers are more productive or not. All this is going to do is throw out more people from work and from job opportunities. You're going to lay off younger workers, entry-level workers won't have an opportunity, and that's been the history. We now have the highest unemployment among teenagers and younger workers and minority workers than we've ever had.
Well, unfortunately, you have a lot of people who are working these entry-level jobs who aren't teenagers, and this is not their first job. So
that's not the majority.
That's not the majority, but that is the reality for some people.
Yeah, the trouble is that you've got people who shouldn't be in those jobs working them full-time, which is also not the intention, right? No one should be working at a fast food restaurant as a full-time job.
So is raising the minimum wage a viable solution?
It is part of the solution. It is not the bigger solution. The bigger solution is to address this gap in opportunity that has opened up over the last 12, 13 years in this country, which is that you have a lot of people who are not qualified for the kinds of jobs that the economy is creating. And so they're trapped in these lower paying jobs and working them at a full-time pace. There are big problems in the way that we have grown our economy. If you look at, for example, the growth in the economy just since the recession, you have 95% of the income growth at the top 1% of the earning scale. That's not. It's a terrible imbalance, and there are a lot of reasons that that's true. Part of it is about the minimum wage, but that's a stopgap measure because, as Nolan pointed out, that's not the way that you grow the economy. It is the way you ensure minimum fairness, and that's what that's about.
Well, it just doesn't work. I mean,
well, it
ends up throwing more people out of work. The problem is, the problem, do we have a wage gap, an income gap in this country? Absolutely, but it is tied to an education and skills gap, as Steve mentioned.
Part of it, yeah.
And you don't fix that by saying, okay, well, you don't have the skills this economy demands, so we're going to prop you up with an artificial wage. We need to start addressing the fact that we're not training our children, we're not training our workers to do the jobs the economy
So
demands.
then do you put the federal money there? Do you put that state money there into job training?
Well, not into job training, not with this federal government. They spend $18 billion a year on job training, and the GAO came out 2 years ago saying it's ineffective, it's duplicative, and nobody ever tracks the results.
Well, didn't the president say in the State of the Union address this week that he wants to revamp that? And
he's given that job to Joe Biden. How has Joe Biden done on every other special assignment he's given?
Actually, Joe Biden's a pretty effective vice president.
Well, this is like the third or fourth time he's giving him a special job, and you never hear anybody coming back and saying, okay, how did he do?
All right, so let's get back to the minimum wage in Michigan and the fact that there is a ballot initiative that's starting to get rolling this week. They have to get between 250,000, 300,000 signatures to get this on the ballot in November for this to be a statewide vote. Do you think they're going to be able to get enough signatures? Is the will there?
Well, yeah, if they've got union money behind them and they can buy votes or buy signatures, certainly they'll get it. I mean, that's how it works in Michigan.
So part of what's going on here is, and Nolan's right about this part of it, it's an election year, and you've got to get Democrats to the polls. The only reason Rick Snyder won in 2010, and the only reason the legislature went completely Republican, was that you had 250 to 300,000 Democrats and independent voters sit home. You can't repeat that this year, and there is some concern about the candidates that the Democrats are likely to field being able to move those numbers. So if you can't do it with your candidates, or if you're unsure that you're going to do it with your candidates, you do it with ballot initiatives. And this is a ballot initiative that will play very well with the Democratic base. My concern would be, how does it play with independent voters
How do you think it does play?
I'm not sure it plays it certainly doesn't play as strongly as it does with those in the Democratic base. This is a very, very Democratic issue. You need independent voters, though, to believe that, enough of them to believe that this is a good thing, to have it affect other races.
It was very interesting. I moderated a community conversation that we do with the Center for Michigan, and one of the large things was minimum wage that people were talking about.
People are hurting. I mean, it's pretty callous to not acknowledge the pain that people who once considered themselves middle or upper lower class are feeling because of the recession and the slow recovery. I mean, we are in a position where we are creating far too much of a gap between those at the upper end of the income scale and those at the.
Well, you're not going to help them by jacking up the minimum wage. You're going to hurt them, because instead of making $7.40 an hour, they're going to make $0.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, it's certainly not.
That's just not. That's not the way to do it. Why not set the minimum wage at $25 an hour? Because $10 an hour is not going to give you a middle class income either.
It's not, but it's also not as clear a one-to-one correlation as you're saying. Raising the minimum wage doesn't just eliminate jobs. It does a lot of other things in the economy. It puts more money into consumers' pockets. Poor people spend much more of what they earn than wealthy people do. So when you raise their incomes, you grow consumer demand. This is why things like the earned income tax credit and other low-income aids are so important.
Earned income tax credit, but when you're telling employers that, okay, we are going to set the wages for your business,
but we do that anyway,
regardless of your ability to pay, or the profitability of your business, or the productivity of your workers, that's getting.
But we do it anyway. I mean, that's why we have
involved in.
And
Well, we have a
it's
minimum
going to be
wage.
interesting to see if there's going to be the political will to get this done. And President Obama said he signed an executive order to raise the minimum wage for federal contracted workers this week at the State of the Union. Stephen, you were at the State of the Union this week. Kind of give me your impressions, because not everyone gets to go see the State
Steve met
of the
the Duck
Union.
Dynasty.
I was looking for you. I was looking for you in the crowd, and that was the most exciting thing for Nolan to hear, that you met the guy from Duck Dynasty.
I did. We stood in line together to get into the gallery. You know, it's pretty cool to sit there, and you know, I mean, they open the door and they say, "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States," and he comes walking through the door and shakes all the hands. It's not a big room, obviously. There's not a lot of people there, so I was very grateful to be there. Thanks to John Dingell, who helped get me the ticket, and Speaker Boehner, who the ticket came from. So.
Next week, Steve's beard will be out.
That's right. I'm gonna be the Duck Dynasty guy. All
right. So let me just, in the quick time that we have left on this topic, give me your impressions of the
speech.
Yeah, of the speech.
You know, it was a very good Democratic speech, right? This was rallying the base of the party around core issues and sort of getting them back in line. I mean, there's a lot of disaffection, I think, among Democrats and liberals with this administration and what it's been able to deliver on. This was intended to get them worked up again. And it was also a challenge, I thought, a very clear challenge to Congress to say, you guys don't do very much, and it's not going to matter to me that much anymore. I'm going to go and do the things that I can do. If you want to come along, so be it. If not, then you'll seem like you're not working.
Does Congress take that challenge, or do they ignore him this week?
The problem is this president thinks there's nothing he can't do. He's completely willing to ignore the Constitution and the limits on his power. And I think there's going to reach a point where America says, wait a minute, we didn't elect a king here. We didn't elect a dictator. The people's representatives have a voice in this whole thing. You have to remember, 63% of the country now have no confidence in him to make the right decisions for the country. That's not a good time to go off unilaterally and start putting an agenda in that
do you agree with that? What
the
he
people
did
don't
with
want.
the executive order?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, Article 2 of the Constitution is about as robust as Article 1, which outlines what Congress can do. And the relationship there is often defined by lack of action, right? Congress has say over things where it chooses to act. It doesn't have say over things where it doesn't choose.
Well,
the executive does.
That's an absolute misinterpretation.
Absolutely
the president has no right to say, well, Congress doesn't want to do this. I'll do it anyway. And in many cases, this president has acted in defiance of Congress's action.
This president has done
where they've specifically said we're not doing this, and he's done it anyway. And the Constitution doesn't allow
what
that.
What he can't do is defy what they've decided to do. He has a lot of
Dream Act.
He has a lot of. That's an executive order issue.
But it was done after Congress had already said.
It's an interpretation of the law.
Cap-and-trade over and over. Yeah. He's acting against the will of Congress. The Constitution does not allow that. Separation of powers does not allow that.
He's done it a lot less than George W. Bush did, who signed far more.
But he's allowed to do the executive order. All right, we'll continue this conversation, I'm sure, in the weeks to come. You know, two developments on the bankruptcy front tonight. The Detroit Institute of Arts has pledged to raise $100 million to add to the cause of saving art and shoring up pensions in the bankruptcy process, plus the city and their plan of adjustment. We won't be able to see the details just yet on this, but let's first talk about the DIA. We talked about this last week, that they may not be able to come up with the $100 million, and now they have said that they are going to. That is a great step in the right direction, I think, in shoring up this deal now. It's
an important step, and they went to their donors and got commitments, which is, you know, what they were expected to do, and you have to commend them for doing that. It's going to add 50% to a year to their fundraising challenge, and apparently people have stepped up and said, we'll do that. Now it moves to the pensioners and the retirees. Will they accept this deal? I think that's the key decision. If the retirees say, we're going to do this, we'll accept this, I think you're going to get the rest of this bankruptcy to go smoothly. If they don't, it's going to be litigated from here to eternity.
You know, it was still a daunting task to say that, you know what, yes, we're going to be able to get that $100 million.
Oh, yeah, well, they don't have it.
Where does that come from, I guess? And
nobody knows.
I mean, how do you start to tap donors? And at some point, are donors tapped out?
Well, the donors that they have are not going to come up with this money. Remember, the museum pledged to raise about $100 million over the next 10 years so that they don't have to come back and ask for a new millage. Now you've got another $100 million, well, actually $50 million, because it's a it's $100 million over 20 years. So over the next 10 years, they've got to raise another $50 million on top of that. This is an institution that is working as hard as any nonprofit institution in this area to be self-sufficient. They're raising about $10 to $12 million a year as it is. They were going to increase that to raise money for the millage. Now they've got to increase it more. They will have to find new donors for this. Now, is that possible in this community? Of course, there's a lot of money. There's a lot of people who don't give a lot of money to the museum now who may step up. But in the end, it could cost them the freedom that they were trying to achieve from these millages. And in 10 years, they could be back in front of voters saying, look, we couldn't make that goal because we had to pay off Detroit's debts.
It's not a bad deal. They bought $1 billion in assets, at least, conservatively estimated, from the city for $100 million. That's not a bad deal.
Well, and also to sweeten...
There's a lot more money going in than that. But,
to sweeten the deal, the Kellogg Foundation also now...
I mean, you're talking about, there's almost $1 billion.
There's
almost $1 billion in this deal now. When you take their $100 million, the 340 or 370 million from the foundations,
350 from the state,
350 from the state, you're getting close to $1 billion for this, which is about
remarkable in this.
Probably what it's
in
worth.
this state, in this community.
And it almost makes you think, okay, so what organizations now are going to be lacking somewhere down the road because they do not have the benefit of this money
that's
somewhere along the line.
That's the question. The foundations all said, well, we'll continue our normal commitment. And the foundation community over the last few years has been amazing in Detroit. We had a piece in the paper today detailing all the various things they're doing, which is simply incredible.
It is incredible. All right, so let's talk about this plan of adjustment that we can't exactly see the details yet, Stephen, but what does this mean now as we're taking this step forward in the process?
Well, this becomes the playbook, right, for the bankruptcy. The way Chapter 9 works, once this plan of adjustment is accepted by the judge as the way that they want to structure the deal, that's sort of the ball game. The creditors will not.
Creditors have to agree or say no.
They actually don't have to agree. They will be able to mount very specific challenges, but they have to be about equal treatment under the deal. In other words, you have to say you're not treating me the same as other people in the same class in the bankruptcy. You can't say I just don't like the deal. And so this is where the advantage of Kevin Orr, with his experience in bankruptcy, with bringing in the consultants that he did and having Jones Day, this is where it should pay off for the city in a deal that gets us out from under a significant amount of that $18 billion in debt and liabilities.
So then where do we go from there, Nolan? I mean, could this then be done much quicker than we thought it would?
Well, I think it could be. It's still possible it could be done on the governor's timetable, which would be by the end of this year, actually by the end of September. He'd like to have it done before Kevin Orr departs. If you can get the creditors on board, I think the big challenge will be getting the pensioners on board. If you get the pension funds to say, man, this is the best we're going to get. As Steve said, we've got nearly $1 billion to work with. It's going to mitigate the cuts to our monthly pensions and our other benefits. I think you could get a deal done on a reasonable timetable.
This has been so interesting to watch. I think when you go into it and you say you're not quite sure what the path is going to be, and it seems to be lining up rather well.
Well, I think the comparison between this bankruptcy and go look at the ones in California, look at the way the one in Alabama is unfolding. It took them so much longer to get to this stage in those other communities, in part because they relied on the elected officials there to manage it. And this is where having Kevin Orr could make but
give some credit to
last word,
give
Nolan.
some credit to Rick Snyder too for putting this whole concept together and for being very actively involved in managing it. In California, you didn't have that. You had very limited local officials trying to do this. You've got two really bright people getting the city through this.
All right, we can't wait to see some of the details in that deal. Stephen, Nolan, thanks so much. Tonight we have a closer look at a new partnership launched this week between nonprofit media organizations around Southeast Michigan, including Detroit Public Television. It's called the Detroit Journalism Cooperative. Its focus, to pool resources and tell in-depth stories on Detroit's path through bankruptcy and beyond. Detroit is in the middle of a historic journey, and while the country watches to see what will happen next, we're living it. Bankruptcy. How does it impact our communities? What do people truly think? Where are the solutions? There are so many stories beyond the headlines, and a new media partnership will help us tell them and bring them to a wide audience. The Detroit Journalism Cooperative is made up of nonprofit media organizations, including the Center for Michigan's Bridge Magazine, WDET Radio, Michigan Radio, the newspapers of New Michigan Media, and Detroit Public Television. Funding for the Detroit Journalism Cooperative comes from the Knight Foundation and the Ford Foundation. Together, we'll work on this opportunity for deeper coverage and engagement with the community during this unprecedented time in Detroit's history. Joining me now to talk about the Detroit Journalism Cooperative is Vince Duffy. He is the news director at Michigan Radio, and Dr. Haig Oshagan, director of New Michigan Media. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me on MiWeek. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having us.
Vince, people might be very familiar with Michigan Radio, but Haig, people may not be familiar with New Michigan Media. Talk a little bit about how many media organizations it's representative of.
New Michigan Media is the collaboration between the largest minority ethnic or the leading minority and ethnic media in this region. The core group includes the Arab American News, the Latino Press, the Jewish News, the Korean Michigan Asian Weekly, and the Michigan Chronicle. But for this project that we'll be talking about, it's the Michigan Citizen that's joining us.
So this is quite a project which is launching today. Vince, talk a little bit about, I think, some of the stories that we're going to start to jump into here as we work all together really as a team.
The goal is to bring all of the public media together to sort of strengthen the whole project of talking about Detroit and its bankruptcy and what's going to be happening after the bankruptcy. And so you'll see all sorts of different stories. I know at Bridge Magazine and the Center for Michigan, they're going to be doing a lot of data-driven reporting. One of the things that we'll be doing at Michigan Radio is taking that data and sort of putting a narrative to it, telling the stories that can come from that data. So our reporter Lester Graham had a story that aired today about the difficulties that Detroit is going to face after its bankruptcy with jobs. And once the city is solvent again, that's not going to solve all the problems. You still have lots of people who are unemployed in Detroit, and a large part of its income tax base coming from people who work in the city but live outside the city. So it'll be stories about what's happening with Detroit, trying to make the bankruptcy as transparent as we can, and what difficulties Detroit is going to face after it's out of the court process, and try to rebuild the city after that.
And that's something that I think we're focused so much on the bankruptcy process right now that maybe we aren't looking down the road, and that's a great way to give perspective to. Hi, people might say we have a lot of media outlets right now. We have the newspapers and we have television stations. What makes this different, do you think?
Well, the collaboration makes a difference as well. I mean, I don't think there's ever been in this region this kind of sharing of resources, sharing of stories, working together, planning out among these outlets how to best cover a major event in the city's life. And I think it should result in much better coverage, much more thorough coverage, much deeper coverage, and I think, a better understanding of the bankruptcy process, both in its sort of legal and technical framework, but as well in its impact on people's lives and how it's going to change Detroit.
Yeah, people might also wonder, how do you choose stories? There are so many stories. There's so many stories to tell. How are we going to go about paring down the most important ones?
Well, there's a meeting that's going to take place each week, and we're in, if the last 24 hours are any indication, we're in sort of constant communication with each other about what stories are going to take place. And it sort of will be decided the way that we do it traditionally. And what are the most interesting things that are happening out there? What are the questions that audience have that they would like to have answered? And what are the things that perhaps aren't being covered on a day-to-day basis that could use a deeper dive? So those are the stories that we'll be looking at and hopefully answering questions that people have about it.
From your perspective, what aren't the stories that are being covered? What are the stories that I think that you would like to see?
Well, our particular contribution of New Michigan Media's newspapers will be to explore the ways in which bankruptcy is affecting the minority communities of the area. And so, for example, the Latino Press will cover the Latino community and the impact of bankruptcy on that community. The Arab American News will cover the impact of the bankruptcy on the Arab community. The Michigan Citizen, the African American community. The Jewish News, the Jewish community. And the Michigan Korean Weekly, the Asian community, the Korean community. And I mean, it should give us different faces to what can often be a faceless process, awash and drowning in numbers. But where really people's lives are being affected, communities are being affected, and I think that's what's often missing. And we hope to be able to sort of put color on on what can often be a very colorless sort of the depiction of a process.
The bankruptcy exists outside of the courtroom, in the streets and neighborhoods of Detroit. And so those are some of the stories that we hope to bring as well.
I think what's also really exciting about this is we all work in tandem. We're all sort of working on sometimes some of the same stories, and we all know each other through public media. But to be able to pool resources and say, what are you working on and how can we help you with that and how can we televise what you're working on radio,
Right.
and is I think probably one of the most exciting processes of this, because we are invested, because we live here and we're living this process as well.
We sometimes are competitors in different areas of the media, but this is a story that's so big that no one single institution has been able to cover the entirety of it as well. And so, the efforts of bringing everybody together, I think, will provide more full, richer coverage, and it's just going to benefit the people who are our audience.
And we're looking so much forward to it. Gentlemen, thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us today as we kick this cooperative off. And you'll be hearing more about the Detroit Journalism Cooperative in the coming year. We're going to have stories and specials here on MiWeek, as well as other programs on Detroit Public Television like American Black Journal and Detroit Performs. Check out the efforts from our partners online at nextchapterdetroit.com and at myweek.org. Tell us what you think and the stories that you would like to see. And that is going to do it for MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. Thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next week.
Business Leaders for Michigan is dedicated to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and economic growth. Learn more at businessleadersformichigan.com. Funding is also provided by Delta.